It was July 5th, 1982. Barcelona shimmered under a furnace sun, the air thick with cigarette smoke, sweat, and expectancy. The Estadio Sarria, an intimate, almost claustrophobic cathedral of concrete and color, was packed. To its limits, 44,000 spectators compressed into a living, roaring organism. The stands pulsed with the rhythm of two nations' dreams. One sang in yellow and blue, confident and carefree. The other, dressed in solemn azure, stood waiting, anxious, hopeful, desperate. For Brazil, this was supposed to be a coronation, a team so fluid, so poetic, that even their warm-ups looked like art. Zico, Socrates, Falcao, names spoken with reverence. They had glided through the group stages, dismantling everyone in their path. To most of the world, they were football. The reincarnation of Pelé's 1970 side. The beautiful game, reborn in Technicolor. And opposite them, Italy. A side mocked, booed, and all but written off. 3 draws in the group stage. No rhythm, no spark, and certainly no goals. Critics at home called them a disgrace. The players refused to speak to the press. Manager Enzo Berzov faced calls to resign mid-tournament. Italy, it seemed, were in Spain only to fill the fixtures. And then there was Paolo Rossi, a striker who hadn't scored in nearly 2 years. A man dragged through scandal, suspended from the game, branded a cheat, a fraud, a ghost of the forward who once lit up Serie A. He was 25 but looked older, worn, unsure, a figure living on the edge of football's memory. Even his teammates whispered doubts. He wasn't sharp. He wasn't fit. Why does Berzot keep playing him? The journalists sneered. Italy have no goals, and he's the reason. But Berzot, calm, chain-smoking, unyielding, saw something others couldn't. He told his staff, Paolo will score. Wait. And so, that scorching afternoon in Barcelona, under the weight of disbelief, Paolo Rossi stood, alone at the halfway line, staring at a wall of yellow shirts that seemed more myth than men. The whistle blew. Brazil danced into their rhythm immediately. Touches, feints, flicks. The ball glided across the grass like it belonged to them, and for a moment, it felt inevitable. Italy were chasing shadows. Then came the 5th minute. A burst down the left from Cabrini, a looping cross cutting through the humid air, and Rossi moved. Not fast, not powerful, but perfectly timed. He rose, eyes locked, neck taut, and with a simple, deliberate flick, he sent the ball skimming into the far corner. Silence. Then a roar, raw and disbelieving. Italy 1, Brazil 0. The camera caught the faces of Brazil's defenders, Leandro Jr., Luizinho, standing still, glancing at one another as if to say, did that really happen? Rossi didn't celebrate wildly. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile, the kind that says, you forgot me, you shouldn't have. That was the first fracture in Brazil's dream. The side that had mesmerized the world suddenly looked mortal. But Brazil being Brazil, they came back. Socrates equalized with grace, side-footing past Dino's off after a dazzling move. The stadium erupted, balance restored. Order returned. The artists were back on their stage. Yet deep inside that Italian side, something stirred. This wasn't the Italy of the group stages. This was the Italy of survival, the Italy of quiet rebellion. Because Berzot's Italy didn't play to please. They played to endure. Their strength wasn't flair. It was faith. Faith in the system, in each other, in the idea that football was about more than beauty. Rossi's story mirrored their own. Mocked, rejected, but unbroken. And in that parallel, Italy found belief. Every time Brazil surged forward, Claudio Gentile snarled into a tackle. Gaetano Scirea swept up behind him with elegance and precision. Zoff barked orders like a general. It was tactical poetry of a different kind, one that spoke the language of grit and geometry rather than rhythm and freedom. Still, Brazil dominated possession. 68%, by the end of the match. 27 shots. Every neutral fan was sure the dam would break. But football doesn't measure poetry, it measures moments. And this match belonged to Paolo Rossi's moments. He would strike again and again and again, but not yet. For now, as halftime approached, the narrative was shifting, the laughter was fading, and the man they called finished was just beginning to write one of football's greatest acts of redemption. This was no longer just a match. It was a duel between ideals, a fight for what football meant. Was it the freedom to dream, or the discipline to endure? The world didn't know it yet, but by the time the final whistle blew in Barcelona, the answer would echo for generations. And the man delivering it would be the one no one believed in. To understand how Paolo Rossi reached that moment, the calm inside the chaos, the redemption inside the roar, we have to go back. Back to Tuscany. Back to the boy who learned to run before he could walk. Back to where the dream began. Long before Paolo Rossi became a name whispered in reverence, he was just Pablito, a small boy, darting through the narrow streets of Prato, Tuscany, a blur of bare feet, dust and laughter. He was small for his age, slight even, but quick as a whisper. When other boys muscled through games, Paolo slipped between them, quiet, calculating, impossible to catch. Football wasn't just a pastime in 1960s Italy, it was an inheritance. The sport flowed through neighborhoods like a religion. Sunday afternoons weren't about church bells, but transistor radios, the voices of commentators trembling with emotion as families crowded around to hear the latest from Serie A. And in that noise, Paolo found his calling. His father, Vittorio, a proud textile worker, wasn't a man of indulgence. He valued hard work, not dreams. Yet when he saw the boy's obsession, he relented. "If you're going to play," he said, "play properly." Vittorio found him a ball, not new, not perfect, and that was enough. Paolo would spend hours chipping it against the garden wall, watching the rebound, adjusting his touch, learning how the ball spoke. That patience, that stillness, it became his secret weapon. He wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest, but he was a thinker, a predator in the making. By the time he joined the youth system at Juventus, the coaches noticed something rare. Paolo's movement wasn't learned, it was instinct. He didn't wait for the ball, he knew where it would go. At 17, he was the kind of forward who vanished between defenders and reappeared behind them. "He moves like smoke," one scout said. But football, like life, tests belief with pain. At 19, Rossi's knees betrayed him. Twice, serious injuries threatened to end his career before it truly began. Juventus loaned him out, Como first, then Vicenza, a polite way of saying, "Prove you still matter." And he did. At Vicenza, under the patient eye of coach Giovan Battista Fabbri, Paolo blossomed. Fabbri didn't force him to change, he built around him. The system favored his instincts, direct, fast transitions, the kind that turned half chances into goals. In the 1976-77 season, Rossi exploded, 21 goals, promotion to Serie A. The following year, 24 more, making him the league's top scorer. Italy suddenly had a new darling, humble, quick, devastating. The press called him Pablito, a nickname born in Argentina during the 1978 World Cup, where his youthful energy lit up the tournament. Italy didn't win, but they impressed. And Rossi, just 21, returned home a star. He was living the dream. Endorsements, magazine covers, transfer rumors. Juventus wanted him back. The Azzurri's future was his. Then came 1980, the Totonero scandal, Italian football's darkest hour. A betting conspiracy that ensnared players, clubs and fans. Rossi's name surfaced among the accused, though the evidence was murky. He insisted on his innocence. "I never took money. I never fixed anything," he told reporters, his voice cracking. But justice in Italian football was swift and unforgiving. 2 years. That was his sentence. The young star who had once graced magazine covers now saw his name dragged through the mud. The public turned on him. The headlines were vicious. Rossi, from hero to shame. For a man whose life revolved around the game, exile was unbearable. He trained alone, far from cameras and crowds, in silence. Some days he considered quitting altogether. "Maybe this is how my story ends," he confided to a friend. But somewhere, deep inside, a small ember refused to die. He thought of his father, of that garden wall, of every moment the ball had taught him to wait. And he waited. When Enzo Bearzot called him back in early 1982, many were outraged. "He's finished," they said. "He's not ready." Rossi hadn't played a full match in over 2 years. His legs were thin, his timing off. But Bearzot saw something the others didn't, not form, but hunger. "He doesn't need to run fast," the coach said. "He just needs to be in the right place." It was an act of faith that bordered on madness. And in those early World Cup games, it seemed Bearzot had lost his mind. Rossi looked lost, off balance, hesitant. No goals, no spark. The press demanded his head. Yet Bearzot's silence never cracked. He refused to drop him, refused to explain himself. Inside the Italian camp, the players were divided. Some wanted fresh legs, others trusted their manager's conviction. Dino Zoff, the captain and elder statesman, pulled Rossi aside one night. "Paolo," he said softly, "you don't need to score in every game. You only need to score when it matters." That became a mantra. The pressure was suffocating. Italy scraped past the group stage on goal difference, barely alive. The next round? Argentina, then Brazil, 2 giants. No one gave Italy a chance. The press back home had already written their obituaries. And yet, within the quiet halls of Italy's training camp in Vigo, something began to shift. Rossi started smiling again. In training, his touches grew sharper, his runs more confident. The teammates who had doubted him began to notice. He was moving like the old Rossi, the one who always arrived a heartbeat before anyone else. When Italy beat Argentina 2-1, he didn't score, but he moved like a man reawakening. The light was back. And as the team prepared to face Brazil, the most dazzling side on earth, Rossi sat in the locker room, staring at his boots. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had been through exile, ridicule, and silence. What was one more mountain to climb? In that quiet before the storm, Enzo Bearzot leaned over and said 6 words that would define everything that followed. "Paolo," he said, "your time has come." The days before Italy met Brazil in Barcelona felt strangely calm. There were no boasts, no speeches, just a steady hum of quiet determination inside the Italian camp. The press still mocked them, calling the team dull, defensive, and, as one Brazilian journalist put it, the anti-football. But to Enzo Bearzot, that was fine. Let them underestimate Italy. Let them talk about beauty. His side would speak through survival. The 1982 World Cup was supposed to belong to flair, the age of Rummenigge, Platini, and Zico. But Italy's story was different. They were tired of the elegance that didn't win trophies. Their plan wasn't to dance. It was to endure, to suffer, and to strike when the world wasn't looking. In the training sessions before the match, Bearzot's voice echoed across the pitch. "Brazil will have the ball. That's fine. We will have the match." Claudio Gentili, the rugged man from Sicily, nodded. He was the enforcer, the defender who treated every duel like a war. He had already silenced Diego Maradona against Argentina, shadowing him with the precision of a bodyguard. Now, his next assignment was Zico, Brazil's golden boy. Gentile's style was not elegant. It was personal. He didn't just tackle, he dismantled rhythm. As Italy studied tapes of Brazil's attacking brilliance, Rossi sat in the back of the room, almost invisible. He wasn't a man who gave rousing speeches or inspired by charisma. His confidence was quiet, internal. Still, there was something different in his eyes that week. A glint, a restlessness. When Bearzot caught him staring out the window one evening, he asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" Rossi smiled. "About scoring," he said. Maybe 3. It wasn't arrogance. It was a whisper of belief, the kind that comes only after everything else has been taken from you. Italy entered the second group phase like ghosts, forgotten by the pundits, ignored by the world. But after their victory over Argentina, they began to believe they belonged. Rossi, though still goalless, was starting to move differently. He chased down long passes, pressed defenders, gestured for balls he once would have ignored. The muscle memory was returning. Berzot noticed. So did Zoff. The veterans could sense that something inside Rossi had clicked back into place. Not speed or sharpness, but instinct. As the team bus rolled toward the Sarria Stadium on July 5th, the streets of Barcelona buzzed with samba drums and yellow flags. Brazil's fans were everywhere, singing, dancing, convinced the day would end in celebration. The Italians stared silently out the window. Gentili tightened his boots. Cirea muttered a prayer. Rossi sat still, hands clasped, eyes shut. Outside, bookmakers gave Italy no chance. Brazilian television crews filmed rehearsals for post-match celebrations. It wasn't arrogance, it was faith in a team that seemed untouchable. Brazil's football wasn't just good, it was beautiful. To most, it transcended competition. And then, the match began. From the first whistle, it was chaos, not from panic, but from intensity. Brazil pressed high, their movement fluid, irresistible. Socrates glided, Falcao dictated, Zico probed. The Italians, though, were unshaken. They pressed in waves, disciplined, narrow, suffocating space. Gentile followed Zico like a shadow, tugging, pushing, snarling, a duel that felt ancient, gladiatorial. At one point, Zico's shirt was ripped open, his face contorted with frustration. The referee waved play on. "It's war," murmured commentator Bruno Pizzul. And yet, amid the fury, Paolo Rossi waited. Berzot's system relied on patience. He knew Brazil would commit bodies forward, that gaps would appear. Rossi was the trigger, the man positioned on the knife's edge between chaos and opportunity. In the 5th minute, Cabrini made his run down the left. His cross hung in the air, time slowing around it. Rossi darted ahead of his marker, Rose, and met the ball cleanly. The header was surgical. Not powerful, not dramatic, but devastatingly precise. 1-0. The crowd gasped. Brazil's defenders froze. Rossi jogged back toward the halfway line, a calm expression on his face. For 2 years, he had been silent. This was his first word. Brazil equalized through Socrates. A low strike past Zoff that silenced Italy's cheers. The rhythm of the match tilted again. For most, this was the sign of Brazil's inevitable takeover. But Italy didn't crack. They regrouped. Berzot kept his players' minds fixed on one thought: stay organized. Wait for the mistake. It came. Cerezo, Brazil's midfielder, turned lazily in his own half, eyes upfield. He never saw Rossi lurking behind him. In a flash, Rossi pounced, stealing the ball and burying it past Waldir Perez. 2-1. The camera cut to the Italian bench, Berzot exhaling smoke, eyes wet with something that looked like relief. By halftime, the world was in disbelief. Brazil had dominated possession, passed with elegance, and dazzled with movement. Yet they trailed. Inside the Italian locker room, Berzot spoke quietly. "Do not defend a lead," he said. "Defend your destiny." Rossi looked around at his teammates, men who had suffered beside him, who had been mocked together, and nodded. "We finish it," he whispered. When the teams returned for the second half, Brazil's attacks grew desperate. Zico's passes were sharper, Falcao's runs more furious. And when Falcao finally equalized again, a thunderbolt into the corner, Brazil's bench erupted. The samba drums roared again. The yellow wave was back, but not for long, because Paolo Rossi was not done. As the crowd swayed and the chants filled the night air, Rossi drifted once. More into the penalty area, invisible, unnoticed, waiting for his moment. A corner came in, Brazil failed to clear, and the ball bounced loose. One touch, then another, and there he was, calm, clinical. certain. The shot was simple, almost understated. But when the net rippled, it carried the weight of resurrection. Rossi had done it. A hat-trick against the greatest team in the world. Beazo didn't celebrate. He just stared at the scoreboard, 3-2, as if confirming he wasn't dreaming. When the whistle blew, Italy had done the impossible. They had outthought, outfought, and outlasted football's most dazzling side. For Rossi, it wasn't just victory. It was vindication. The man they had laughed at had destroyed the team everyone adored. But the story wasn't finished. The world still doubted whether Italy could sustain this miracle, whether one man's redemption could carry a nation to glory. The next battles would test everything they had left: body, mind, and faith. Barcelona was left in stunned silence that night. The match at the Estadio Sarria was supposed to be a celebration of Brazil's artistry, a coronation of the game's poets. Instead, it became an autopsy, the night when beauty was dissected by discipline. For Italy, the victory wasn't just a result. It was a manifesto, but the war wasn't over. With Brazil slain, Italy now stood at the edge of history. They had survived the so-called group of death, and the players knew it. Argentina and Brazil, both gone. The critics who had called them dull were now silent. For the first time, Italy walked into the semi-final not as underdogs, but as something far more dangerous: believers. Yet victory had cost them. The match against Brazil had drained everything: physically, emotionally, spiritually. Rossi's legs ached. Gentile's shirt was torn, his arms bruised. Sarria's voice was gone from constant barking of orders. But when they looked around the locker room, every man's eyes burned with a quiet light. Next came Poland, a disciplined, organized side, but without their suspended talisman, Zbigniew Boniek. Beazo knew this was Italy's chance to impose control. He gathered his players the night before the match and spoke with the gravity of a general. "You have faced chaos," he said. "Now you must face patience. Do not chase the game. Let it come to you." The match in Barcelona's Camp Nou was tense, deliberate. Poland sat deep, closing space, probing for counters. But Rossi was no longer waiting for luck. He was hunting. Midway through the first half, a cross from Conti curved into the box. Rossi ghosted between two defenders, timing his run with mathematical precision. A single touch, a low finish. 1-0. The roar from the stands was no longer surprise. It was recognition. The world had seen enough to know Paolo Rossi was back. In the second half, he struck again. Another run, another finish, another roar. The calmness in his movements seemed almost surreal. The same man who had been mocked weeks earlier was now playing as if born for the moment. 2 goals. Another victory. Italy were going to the World Cup final. The nation exploded. From Turin to Palermo, church bells rang through the night. Streets filled with tricolor flags and chants of "Pablito, Pablito." The man who had been exiled was now Italy's hero. But inside the camp, there was no celebration. Beazo didn't allow it. "We've won nothing yet," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed emotion. He had believed in Rossi when the world didn't. Now, his faith was being repaid in goals. And standing between Italy and immortality was West Germany. The Germans had fought their own war of endurance. Their semi-final against France in Seville had been one of the most brutal matches in football history. 3-3 after extra time, ending in a penalty shootout that left players collapsed on the pitch. Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, their captain, was battered and half fit. Harald Schumacher, their goalkeeper, had become infamous for his collision with Patrick Battiston. A moment that turned sympathy away from Germany and toward whoever faced them next. For Italy, it was destiny. For Germany, it was survival. On the eve of the final in Madrid's Santiago Bernabeu, Beazo kept his squad isolated. No press, no distractions, only silence and ritual. Gentile and Sarria studied tapes of Rummenigge. Rossi sat with Zoff, watching German set pieces over and over. There were no egos here, only purpose. Meanwhile, back home, Italy was suspended in anticipation. Shops closed early. Families gathered around televisions. Even the Vatican shifted mass schedules so people wouldn't miss kickoff. It felt less like a game and more like Judgment Day. July, the stadium glowed in gold light as evening descended on Madrid. Royalty, dignitaries, legends, all present for football's final act. The air was electric, heavy with history. From the first whistle, Germany pushed high. Breitner and Litbarski probed the flanks. Magath tested from distance. Zoff's gloves were steady, his face unreadable. Italy responded with their signature calm, absorbing, countering, waiting. Then came the first flashpoint. Cabrini, surging into the box, was tripped. Penalty. The Italian fans erupted. Rossi turned away, unable to watch as Cabrini stepped up. The shot curved wide. Gasps, disbelief. For a brief moment, it felt as if the gods were turning on Italy again. But Bearzot didn't flinch. From the sidelines, he simply raised his hand, signaling for calm. His players nodded. This wasn't a team built on panic anymore. They had been to the depths and survived. Minutes later, the tide turned. Tardelli and Conti began slicing through Germany's midfield, their passes sharp and fearless. Rossi drifted into space, scanning, waiting. Then, in the 57th minute, the moment arrived. A low cross from Gentile deflected, bouncing awkwardly through the penalty area. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Everyone except Paolo Rossi. He lunged, guiding the ball past Schumacher. Goal. The camera caught his face. No wild celebration, just a half smile, almost disbelief. His 5th goal in 2 games. Italy 1, Germany 0. The dam had broken. Minutes later, Tardelli smashed in the second. His scream, eyes wide, fists pumping, tears spilling, became one of football's immortal images. Tardelli's cry, they'd call it. It was the sound of a nation releasing decades of frustration, doubt, and fear. And then came the third, a masterpiece. Conti's breakaway, Altobelli's finish. The Bernabeu thundered with blue. Germany would pull one back through Breitner. But it didn't matter. By then, Italy were untouchable. When the final whistle blew, Dino Zoff collapsed to his knees, tears streaking his face. The 40-year-old captain, stoic through every storm, finally let emotion wash over him. Bearzot stood motionless on the sideline, arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips. Paolo Rossi walked toward the stands, his hands raised, the stadium lights reflecting off his sweat-soaked face. From disgrace to glory, from exile to ecstasy, he had carried Italy across the fire. But the journey's end wasn't just triumph. It was transformation. Rossi's redemption was complete, yet it had cost him everything: time, reputation, peace. And in that moment, as the confetti rained and the world watched Italy lift the trophy, one truth crystallized in the humid Madrid air. Sometimes, to become eternal, you must first be forgotten. Madrid, July 11th, 1982. The Santiago Bernabeu was a sea of white and blue, vibrating with sound and tension. Flags rippled like waves. Television cameras panned across faces filled with nerves, hope, and something deeper, the feeling that they were witnessing the final act of an epic. For Paolo Rossi, it was more than a match. It was the end of an odyssey. 2 years earlier, he had been watching football on television as an outcast, his name whispered like a curse. Now he stood on the pitch, minutes away from immortality. The opening minutes were chaos wrapped in silence. Both teams nervous, neither wanting to blink first. West Germany bruised but defiant, pressed high, desperate to impose order. Italy, calm but tense, soaked it in, their shape compact, their communication constant. Gentile and Cirea were precise, reading the Germans' intentions like a script. Cabrini and Conti stretched wide, offering escape routes. In midfield, Tardelli and Oriali hunted in pairs, 2 wolves moving in perfect sync. And in goal, Dino Zoff, the oldest man on the pitch, stood as still as a mountain. It was football as chess. every move calculated, every inch contested. Then came the moment that could have broken them. 25 minutes in, Cabrini surged forward, cutting between defenders. The crowd gasped as he was clipped. The referee pointed to the spot. Penalty. Italy had a chance to seize control early. Cabrini, who had drawn the foul, placed the ball. He looked up, saw Schumacher bouncing on his line and exhaled. The whistle blew, and the ball curved wide. A stunned silence washed over the Bernabeu. Cabrini dropped to his knees. Rossi turned away, hands on his head. For an instant, every Italian heart stopped beating. But Bezo didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply stepped to the edge of his technical area, raised his arm, and called out, "Tranquilli, stay calm!" And Italy did. The missed penalty didn't break them. It hardened them. From that moment, the Azzurri became something elemental, a team not of stars, but of survivors. Midway through the second half, destiny shifted. Conti broke down the wing, evading a tackle and whipping in a low cross. It deflected once, twice, chaos in the box, and there was Rossi. The ball met his boot like fate itself. A flick, a finish, a goal. Simple, clean, inevitable. 1-0, Italy. Rossi didn't sprint. He didn't shout. He just stood still, arms raised, eyes closed. The stadium shook. On the sidelines, Bezo exhaled a cloud of smoke, his face unreadable. He had seen this ending long before anyone else did. Germany pressed harder now. Breitner, Rummenigge, Litbarski, they threw everything forward. But the Italian backline bent, never broke. Gentile's tackles grew sharper, Sarea's anticipation almost supernatural. And Zoff, stoic, immovable, caught, parried, commanded. Then came the second blow. Marco Tardelli, the iron-hearted midfielder, drifted into the box as a pass rolled his way. He didn't think. He didn't aim. He simply struck, a left-footed rocket curling into the corner. The net bulged. And in that instant, the world witnessed something transcendent. Tardelli ran, screaming, eyes wide in disbelief and ecstasy. His cry, primal, uncontrollable, tore through the Bernabeu. It wasn't celebration, it was release. The release of years of struggle, criticism, and doubt. It became an image that would define the sport forever. The Tardelli scream. Bezo buried his face in his hands. Rossi collapsed to his knees, laughing and crying at once. The players piled on. It was chaos, purity, and joy, all in one unrepeatable moment. 2-0, Italy. But destiny wasn't done writing. Minutes later, a counter-attack of perfection, Conti racing down the right, the German defense in disarray. He squared the ball across the box to Alessandro Altobelli, the substitute, the forgotten man, who side-footed into the net. 3-0. For a few seconds, time seemed to stop. The camera cut to the stands, tears, disbelief, songs breaking out like thunder. Rossi, exhausted, threw his arms around Conti. Berzot, usually stoic, smiled. Zoff's lips trembled as he looked up toward the sky. It was over, not by the clock, but by fate. Germany would pull one back through Breitner, a symbolic goal, nothing more. The scoreboard read 3-1, but the battle had been decided long before. When the final whistle blew, the roar that rose from Madrid could be heard across Italy. In Rome, car horns blared for hours. In Naples, fireworks painted the sky. In the villages of Sicily and the alleys of Turin, people hugged strangers, wept, sang, and shouted the same name again and again, Pablito! Pablito! Paolo Rossi, the man who had once been banned, forgotten, laughed at, was now a world champion. He finished the tournament with 6 goals, the Golden Boot, and the Golden Ball. But those trophies were symbols, not rewards. What truly mattered was the journey, from the darkness of disgrace to the blinding light of redemption. As Rossi lifted the World Cup trophy alongside Dino Zoff, cameras caught a brief glance between them. No words, just understanding. 2 men who had endured everything, who had carried the weight of a nation through fire. Above them, the confetti fell like snow. The blue shirts gleamed under the Bernabeu lights, and somewhere deep within the noise, Paolo Rossi smiled, not with arrogance, but with peace. Because redemption, in football and in life, never arrives with applause. It arrives in silence, in sweat, in belief, and in one perfect moment when everything that once broke you finally makes sense. The morning after Italy's triumph, the streets were still alive. Horns echoed through dawn, flags hung from balconies, fountains ran blue, white, and red. Across the nation, people didn't sleep. They floated. Rome felt like a dreamscape. Strangers hugged in the piazzas, children draped themselves in the tricolor, and radios replayed the voice of commentator Nando Martellini over and over again. Campioni del mondo, campioni del mondo, campioni del mondo. World champions. Paolo Rossi woke up in a haze of disbelief. His body ached, his voice was gone, his mind replaying moments like flashes of film. The header against Brazil, the second goal, the look on Bezos' face when the final whistle blew. He hadn't slept. None of them had. When the Italian squad returned home, their plane touched down in Rome to a scene that defied comprehension. Tens of thousands lined the tarmac. People climbed light poles, wept and cheered as the players emerged with the trophy held high. In that instant, all the pain of the past, the scandal, the ridicule, the doubt, dissolved into pure golden euphoria. For Italy, this was more than a sporting victory. It was a national healing. The country had been fractured, politically, socially, emotionally, scarred by years of unrest, corruption, and cynicism. But for one night, Italy was united again. And at the center of it all stood Paolo Rossi, the symbol of rebirth. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest or the most naturally gifted, but he embodied something Italians understood better than anyone: resilience, the quiet strength to endure, to fall, and to rise again. That was the essence of Bezos' Italy, a team built not on glamour, but on grit. Zoff, the elder statesman who guarded the net with unflinching calm; Gentile, the warrior who turned marking into art; Cirea, the silent conductor, elegance disguised as defense. And at the tip of the spear, Rossi, the man who waited for destiny and met it with composure. The world took notice. Tactics shifted. Nations learned that beauty alone no longer won trophies. Football's romantic era, the age of free-flowing Brazil, was over. What began in the Saria that day marked the rise of something new, the reign of realism. The 1982 World Cup changed the balance of the sport. Coaches studied Italy's shape, its transitions, its discipline. For decades, the echoes of Bezos' blueprint could be seen in the DNA of modern football, from Sacchi's Milan to Lippi's Juventus, even to the pragmatic champions of the 21st century. But no tactical legacy was stronger than Rossi's personal one. For him, redemption was not just about goals, it was about grace. He never spoke bitterly about his suspension, never sought revenge against his critics. He simply smiled when asked about it. "If I hadn't suffered," he once said, "I would never have understood how much this means." After the World Cup, Rossi returned to Juventus, where he added titles, European Cups, and admiration to his career. But no victory ever felt like 1982. That summer had given him something football rarely grants: closure. Years later, when journalists asked him about the Brazil match, he would pause before answering. "They were better," he'd say softly, "but we were wiser." Because that was the truth. Italy's triumph wasn't about brilliance, it was about belief. The belief that imperfection could still overcome beauty, that order could humble chaos, that redemption could come from ruin. And as time passed, the myth grew. The name Paolo Rossi became shorthand for resurrection. When young players faced suspension, injury, or ridicule, coaches would remind them, "Remember Rossi." He had become a symbol far larger than sport, proof that a man can lose everything and still return, stronger, humbler, and free. When Rossi passed away in 2020, tributes poured in from around the world. In Italy, television stations replayed his hat-trick against Brazil. Newspapers filled front pages with his smile. that quiet, gentle smile of a man who knew what it meant to fall and rise. Zico, his old rival, sent a message from Brazil. "He destroyed my dreams," he wrote, "but he gave the world one of the greatest stories in football." And that is Paolo Rossi's true legacy. Not the goals, not the trophies, but the story, the transformation of humiliation into honor, despair into destiny. On that July afternoon in Barcelona, as Brazil's defenders laughed and the world dismissed him, Rossi stood on the edge of history. 90 minutes later, he wasn't just a striker again. He was a symbol of redemption. The echoes of that day still reverberate through football's history. The Estadio Sarria no longer stands. It was demolished in 1997, but for those who remember, its ghost still breathes through every underdog victory, every story of second chances. Because that's what Paolo Rossi gave to football. Hope. Hope that no fall is final. Hope that faith can outlast failure. Hope that, even when the world laughs, you can still rise, still fight, still find your way back to glory. In the end, Paolo Rossi didn't just send Italy to the World Cup. He reminded the world why we love this game, because in 90 minutes, it can turn laughter into awe, despair into ecstasy, and a forgotten man into a legend. And if this story moved you, if the echoes of the World Cup still make your heart beat a little faster, stay with us. More journeys, more legends, more moments that shaped the world's game are still to come. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join this growing community of football storytellers, because the past is never just history. It's the heartbeat of everything still to come.